The morning light filtered into the bedroom, casting a warm glow over the quilted bedcover. Margaret blinked awake, feeling the familiar aches in her bones as she stretched. At 82 years old, it took her joints a bit longer to limber up nowadays. She slowly sat up, adjusting the pillows behind her back. Her eyes fell on the framed photo on the nightstand of herself and George on their wedding day almost 60 years ago. They were so young then, beaming with joy and anticipation of the life ahead of them. After her usual morning routine of washing up and getting dressed, Margaret made her way to the kitchen. She filled the tea kettle with water and put it on the stove to boil before popping a slice of bread into the toaster. Leaning against the counter, she gazed out the window above the sink. Golden morning light washed over the backyard, the drooping branches of the old maple tree just starting to tinge with hints of red and orange. Fall was coming earlier nowadays, it seemed. Margaret sighed quietly. The changing seasons reminded her of how much time had passed. She missed George fiercely, even after 5 years. The pain of his loss still so raw some days. They had shared over 50 years together before he passed. She could still hear his off-key singing in the workshop, still see his grinning face peering down at her when she woke in the mornings. The little everyday moments most people overlooked had filled her heart to the brim. The house felt so empty without him now, despite all their children coming by regularly to visit. She was grateful for them, truly, but it wasn't the same. The whistling kettle broke Margaret from her reverie. She slowly shuffled over to pull it from the heat, pouring the steaming water over an Earl Grey tea bag in her favorite chipped mug. The toast popped up, and she carefully carried her simple breakfast to the little kitchen table by the window that looked out over the backyard. The maple tree shook gently in the breeze, a few early leaves drifting down to the grass below. As she ate, Margaret opened up the daily newspaper and pulled out the crossword puzzle. She'd gotten quite good at them over the years. The black and white squares were comforting in their familiarity. She took a pen from her pocket and slowly started filling in the boxes, taking small bites of toast in between clues. The phone rang, loud and shrill. Margaret frowned, glancing at the wall clock which read 7:15 a.m. No one ever called this early unless. Her frown deepened. She grasped her cane and pushed herself up from the chair, shuffling to pick up the receiver. "Hello?" Her daughter Carol's frantic voice greeted her. "Mom, we're on our way to the hospital. Dad collapsed while making breakfast. They think it might have been a heart attack." Margaret's breath caught, her own heart clenching with fear. Carol's husband Jack had some health issues recently, though she thought he'd been doing better after his pacemaker surgery last year. "I'll meet you there," Margaret said quickly. She could hear Carol still talking urgently on the other end as she set down the phone with shaking hands. This couldn't be happening, not Jack too. She hurried into the front hall closet to pull out her coat. As she struggled into it, the sight of George's old leather jacket caught her eye amongst the clutter on the shelf. Without thinking, she reached out and touched the worn sleeve, swallowing hard. "Please be okay," she whispered under her breath like a prayer, to Jack and all the people she still loved in this world. It seemed so tenuous now, knowing in a single moment everything could be taken away no matter the years that came before it. She needed more time. They all did. Drawing in an unsteady breath, Margaret grabbed her purse and keys with quivering hands. She made her way haltingly down the front steps to the waiting car, the screen door banging shut behind her. Margaret drove as quickly as she could manage to the hospital, gripped with fear over Jack's heart attack. He had to make it through this. The doctors had reassured them last year that the pacemaker would help prevent something like this. She pulled up to the cardiac wing, tires squealing slightly as she whipped into the first empty parking spot. Moving urgently despite her stiff limbs, she hurried inside, following the signs until she found herself in a sterile waiting room filled with rows of faded blue chairs. Carol popped up immediately when she saw her mother rush in. "Mom, any word yet on Dad?" Her voice shook ever so slightly as she wrapped Margaret in a tight hug. "No, nothing. I just got here. Are the doctors still with him? How bad was it?" Margaret pulled back to search her daughter's exhausted face. Light glinted off the silver strands threaded liberally now through Carol's short dark hair. When had she started going gray? "We're still waiting to hear. It was really scary, Mom." His eyes rolled back, and he just crumpled making his toast and eggs this morning. Like a marionette with the strings cut, Carol's voice hitched on the words, and she looked away, composing herself. Margaret reached out and squeezed her daughter's hand, swallowing past the lump in her own throat. But he's getting help now. We just have to pray he'll come through this." She guided Carol gently back toward 2 empty seats, easing herself down with stifled groan. Her lower back had been bothering her more lately no matter what she tried. Probably just part of getting old, though she'd never complain about that to Carol. Her daughter had enough to worry about right now. The minutes crawled by as they waited for word on Jack's condition. A TV buzzed quietly in the corner of the room, turned to a morning talk show with the volume muted. Margaret found it impossible to focus on the book she'd tucked in her purse. The words blurred together meaninglessly whenever she tried reading a few paragraphs. Finally, after what felt an eternity, a doctor in blue scrubs appeared in the waiting room doorway holding a metal clipboard. "Family of Jack Miller," he called out. Margaret and Carol both surged to their feet. The doctor greeted them kindly, introducing himself as Dr. Fitzgerald, the cardiologist overseeing Jack's care. He led them out into an empty hallway for more privacy before providing an update. "So your husband suffered what we call an ST elevation myocardial infarction. That's the deadliest type of heart attack caused by a prolonged blockage cutting blood flow to the heart." Carol let out a soft gasp, her shoulders sagging. Margaret reached out to clasp her hand, blinking hard against the sting of tears welling in her eyes. The doctor continued gently, "It was quite serious when he arrived, and we had to act fast. But the good news is we were able to open up the blocked artery and restore normal blood flow using emergency angioplasty and stents. He's being carefully monitored now in the cardiac ICU." Margaret let out a long breath. The tight bands that had cinched her chest ever since Carol's phone call that morning finally started to loosen. "So he's stable now? And he'll recover fully?" "He's not out of the woods yet," Dr. Fitzgerald cautioned. "The next 24 hours are critical. But the procedure went well, and so long as there are no major complications, I'm hopeful for a full recovery with proper lifestyle changes and medication." Carol lifted her head. "Can we see him?" The doctor nodded. "Briefly. He's still unconscious and needs to rest. Don't be alarmed by all the equipment and monitors. We're watching him closely." He led them to the ICU wing, their footsteps echoing sharply against the linoleum tiles. The chemical aroma of cleaners hung heavy in the air. Margaret always hated that hospital smell, remembering too clearly the weeks spent camped anxiously by George's bedside when the cancer had whittled his strong body away to nothing those last agonizing months. She pushed the awful memories away, focusing on putting one unsteady foot in front of the other. Jack needed her now. They entered the dim, high-ceilinged room filled with blinking machinery surrounding each patient bay. Dr. Fitzgerald guided them toward Jack's area curtained off for privacy. "Just a few minutes for now," he reminded gently before slipping away to check other patients. Margaret steeled herself as Carol slowly pulled back the curtain. Her breath caught at the sight of her normally vibrant, animated son-in-law lying perfectly still amid the tubes and wires and monotonous beeping monitors. His skin looked ashen and waxy beneath the fluorescent lights. Carol let out a muffled sob, sinking down into the chair at Jack's bedside to clutch his limp hand. Margaret eased herself gingerly onto the edge of the bed facing her daughter. She reached across to run a comforting hand over Carol's bowed shoulders. "He's going to be okay, sweetheart. You heard what the doctor said about getting ahead of things quickly with the emergency treatment. All we can do now is pray and be patient." Carol nodded tearily without lifting her head from where it rested near Jack's shoulder. Margaret kept up the soothing motions across her daughter's back, offering soft words of comfort and hope. After a few moments, she noticed Carol's breathing deepen into the slower rhythms of sleep. Poor dear must be absolutely exhausted from the emotional upheaval today, stacked on top of all her regular worries with family and career. Margaret knew her daughter struggled with anxiety issues made worse lately by the pressures of her high-level job. Making sure the rails were locked securely, Margaret maneuvered herself further onto the bed so Carol could stretch her legs and rest more comfortably curled against Jack's side. Her own legs dangled well above the floor now, but that didn't matter. She'd stay like this as long as they needed so her daughter could get some much-needed sleep. Alone with her thoughts, Margaret gazed down at the two people she loved most in this world besides her late husband. She hated seeing them so vulnerable like this in the sterile, alien environment of machines beeping and disembodied voices flowing past the curtains shielding their small corner. Both Jack and Carol had been generally healthy and active until recently dealing with his heart problems and her ongoing issues with anxiety and insomnia. Seeing them now, Margaret felt suddenly unsure if Carol was equipped to handle this alone. She realized her daughter still needed her in ways she hadn't fully recognized before. The thought sent a spike of fear through her own heart, because whether she acknowledged it or not, Margaret could feel her own health steadily declining too. The last 5 years without George had been so difficult, the grief and loneliness like a shroud she couldn't seem to shed. Her children begged her to consider moving to assisted living apartments nearby. But the house where she'd raised them and shared a lifetime of memories with her beloved husband held too much meaning to simply walk away. In darker moments, though, Margaret questioned secretly if she was just being stubborn, clinging to the familiar old home and routines that inevitably grew harder over time. Some nights left her exhausted, just making a simple frozen dinner and eased joints that throbbed painfully despite the maximum safe levels of pain medication she allowed herself. Too proud for now to acquire a scooter or walker, she'd taken more than one bad spill navigating buckled sidewalks or snowy steps in recent winters. Worst was the gnawing loneliness of going to bed night after night without George's familiar warmth beside her under the covers they'd shared since the earliest years of their marriage. The empty space in her full-sized bed loomed larger than it had any right to, making her feel small and overwhelmed with sorrow. She still regularly talked to George, though, as if he could hear her, whispering updates on their grandchildren's latest accomplishments or what mischief the neighborhood squirrels had gotten into that day. But there was no denying the absence behind his easy chair at the dining table during loud family holiday gatherings or heating 2 smaller portions from now frozen casserole recipes they used to whip up together in the bright, cheery kitchen. Her whole world had dimmed by degrees without her beloved husband and best friend. Swallowing past the lump rising in her throat, Margaret forced herself to take a deep, centering breath. She couldn't travel too far down that rabbit hole of grief and bitterness over all that she'd lost. Not now, when Carol and Jack needed her present fully in this moment. As she refocused on her sleeping daughter, still clinging to Jack for comfort even in unconsciousness, Margaret vowed fiercely to herself she would persevere whatever it took to stay strong and healthy for them both as long as possible. They deserved that. After all, Carol had done ferrying Margaret faithfully to doctor's appointments, bringing groceries by the house and handling yard upkeep these last years since George had passed. And Jack had never complained about relinquishing his usual role as grill master and party organizer at various family events to step in quietly doing minor repairs or heavy lifting wherever Margaret needed an extra hand. She owed them the same support now when the tables turned and years of strain showed through the brave fronts they both worked so hard to maintain in front of her. With George gone, Jack, Carol, and their 2 almost grown children, Emily and Aiden, had become the center of Margaret's small family universe. She needed more time to see her oldest grandchildren off to college soon and share more precious moments surrounded by those she loved most. The heart monitor beeped steadily in the background as Margaret kept her silent watch, hours slipping past unnoticed. Nurses came intermittently to check vitals and note information on Jack's chart, careful not to disturb the sleeping daughter slumped over the bedside. Margaret observed them all quietly, one hand still resting on Carol's back as she guarded their fitful rest. When at last Jack's eyelids finally fluttered open, Margaret almost missed it, waiting for another nurse to check in. She held her breath as his dazed eyes traveled slowly around the hospital equipment before landing on his wife passed out beside him. Carol began to stir then too as she sensed her husband regaining consciousness. "Hey you," Jack croaked weakly through dry, cracked lips. "Come here often?" His attempt at humor dissolved into coughing, but Carol was already surging up to grab the waiting cup of water with a straw, tears streaking her face. "Just take tiny sips," she managed unevenly, holding the cup for him with shaking hands. Jack gazed up at her, the gold flecks in his green eyes glowing brighter with some of their usual mischief. He took careful sips until the cup emptied, then settled back with a tired sigh. Noticing Margaret hovering anxiously near the bed rail behind Carol, he attempted a lopsided smile. "Well, this isn't quite how I intended us all to spend our morning." A watery laugh burst from Carol's chest. Even Margaret had to smile and blink back her own tears at the weary humor in Jack's hoarse voice. Her son-in-law was still very pale and drawn, but the worst was over now. She could see that much in the way he held his wife's gaze with quiet purpose, giving her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. They would tackle all of it, whatever lay ahead, right alongside each other, just as she and George had for over 50 blissful years. Overwhelmed with relief and gratitude, Margaret bowed her head, silently offering up thanks for this glimpse of grace and the gift of more time with those most dear. When she lifted her head, Carol had hit the call button and stood adjusting pillows to help Jack sit up slightly in anticipation of the nurse's visit. Her daughter's movements held new energy and determination fueled by cautious optimism. Margaret eased stiff limbs down off the high bed. She knew she should give them some privacy with the medical team and also call home to update the rest of the family soon clamoring for news. But she grasped Jack's blanketed leg first in a brief, fierce hug, wanting, no needing, him to understand what today meant. His larger hand covered hers with reassuring pressure. Their eyes met in silent understanding. Then Margaret slipped past the curtain back out to the less oppressive waiting room, each step somehow feeling lighter than before. She found an empty corner and pulled out her cell phone to start making calls, beginning with her son Thomas, who lived across the country. Hearing the cautious hope threading through her voice as she shared the update on Jack's condition, Thomas paused the other family members' anxious questions in the background. "It sounds like you're holding up all right, Mom, but take care of yourself too, okay? Don't forget to eat and rest some. Let us know if there's anything at all we can do from here." Margaret promised she would, warmth spreading through her at the concern in her youngest child's voice. After ending the call, she scrolled to Emily's number next, knowing Jack's daughter would be worrying herself sick waiting for news. Margaret was so focused relaying the positive report to relieve the poor girl's fears that she didn't even notice Carol slip quietly into the seat beside her until she ended the call. "He's sleeping again, but his color looks better already," Carol said softly. "The doctors say he'll likely be moved out of ICU in another day or so if all stays stable." Margaret clasped her daughter's hand, giving it a light squeeze. "That's wonderful news. And how are you holding up, sweetheart?" Carol managed a tremulous but genuine smile. "Much better now that the worst seems to be behind us. I was so scared, Mom, but having you there, it helped more than you know." Impulsively, Margaret wrapped her arms around her daughter, hugging her close the way she had when Carol was still small enough to climb into her lap with skinned knees from learning to ride a bike. They stayed like that for a long moment, Margaret gently stroking her daughter's hair. When they finally drew back, Carol kept her hand clasped in Margaret's, taking strength from the anchor of her mother's steadfast support the way she always had. Margaret recognized that vulnerable, trusting gaze so clearly in this moment and felt her earlier solemn vow deepen, to stand strong for Carol and her family in whatever way she could for as long as possible, which meant taking better care of herself whether she liked it or not. Over the next week, Margaret temporarily moved into Carol and Jack's guest bedroom so she could be on hand to help while he continued recovering at home. She drove Jack to his barrage of follow-up appointments and cardiac rehab sessions when Carol got bogged down with an emergency project deadline at work. At night, she prepared simple, nutritious meals for them all and made sure Jack stuck to the strict new diet guidelines while her daughter battled lingering anxiety and insomnia. During quieter moments, Margaret also started having more open conversations with Carol about options for streamlining her current living situation to preserve energy and independence longer term. She could tell the gesture meant the world to Carol, who had worried silently for years over her mother rattling too alone around the old family home, now much too large for one person. While part of Margaret's heart clenched at the thought of leaving that treasured house filled with so many memories, she also knew in her soul it was the right decision. Lightening the load would gift her more years, hopefully, to support those she loved who still needed her so. So with Carol and Emily's help sorting and packing, Margaret began the bittersweet process of downsizing to a smaller two-bedroom unit in a newer independent senior apartments building only a few blocks away. The location allowed her to easily walk places downtown she'd always enjoyed with George while keeping involved in the younger family's lives, stopping by regularly for dinner or activities with the grandkids. She made sure to bring George's old leather jacket to hang by the door of her cozier new home, keeping those cherished memories alive. There were candid conversations, too, with her grown children about legal and financial planning for eventual long-term care needs. Margaret stubbornly insisted she had no intentions of needing anything like that for a good long while. But she could see relief in her loved one's eyes having difficult talks out in the open so they could prepare in case her health declined faster than expected. Growing older came with sober realities, but focusing on what she could control lightened that load. The years seemed to pass more quickly after that. Soon Aiden left for college too, while Jack recovered well under the doctor's and Carol's vigilant care. There were sweet high school graduations, happy weddings, laughter-filled family parties, and more solemn gatherings to mourn and honor those beloved ghosts who slipped away far too soon. And there was the pure joy when Carol first placed tiny newborn Isla, all pink squalling perfection, into Margaret's cradled arms, followed by 2 more grandbabies added joyfully to the fold before long. Every twinge in her joints or occasional unsteadiness was a small price to pay for that soul-filling privilege of cradling new life with all its bright shining promise. Nights grew longer and colder though as time marched inexorably onward. The painful awareness that even those most treasured can't stay forever became part of Margaret's reality the day they finally moved George's best friend Walt, barely recognizable behind the fog of dementia, into full-time assisted living care. Seeing herself reflected in the hunched shuffle of once vital elders who now struggled to recall their own grandchildren's names was the hardest glimpse of fate she'd faced. Not all were lucky enough to slip peacefully away and sleep like her George when the merciless time came to part. But there was solace and connection too amongst others journeying the same long road, especially at the senior center where Margaret now volunteered twice a week coordinating arts and crafts activities. She particularly enjoyed this creative outlet after retiring herself from the local library's children's programming where storytime visits had often healed her loneliest days over the years raising her babies alone while George traveled. Her proudest volunteer achievement came when the older veterans participating in the center's band project mastered a moving rendition of George's favorite patriotic anthem for the town parade one emotional year that still left Margaret's vision blurred watching from the sidewalk. So much proud history bound up in fragile yet resilient souls. She understood better than most just how precious was this narrowing window left to give and receive small kindnesses that outlast fading youth or health. As ever, precious moments with family soothed the harder seasons when the aches grew sharper and days blurred together in unrelenting gray. Every milestone still brought bittersweet joy, even when Thomas first moved both his now aging parents into assisted living near him out west. Then several years later, Margaret could only manage misty smiles wheeling her own wheelchair up the ramp into the nursing home wing for Walt's memorial, no longer strong enough herself to risk icy winter streets and flight solo. The smiling photos and children's artwork covering her room's walls helped it feel less sterile at least. And there was comfort having kind Sandy, her favorite nurse, stop by often for long chats about grandbabies or the elaborate jigsaw puzzles they worked on together to exercise Margaret's mind. She gave thanks every night for those small mercies and for Carol's devoted visits sharing family stories and precious snuggles with tiny great-grandbabies who lit up when their Gigi Maggie came wheeling into view. Of course, the brutal pain of loss scraped deep at times despite such blessings when Jack Spadney finally gave out on the golf course that he loved so much and dear friends she'd known since childhood faded slowly but surely from this earthly plane. Saying goodbye never got easier even when you knew it was close. The grief just as profound. But on her worst days sinking beneath mourning and anger over slipping faculties in her disease-ravaged brain, Margaret still latched onto hope refusing to drown under rising despair. When names and places unwittingly escaped her feeble grasp, Carol or Emily would tenderly redirect her spiraling thoughts back to positivity and gratitude in the moment at hand. And Margaret had trained herself long ago when she first lost George to consciously soak up joy wherever she could find it. In the tart sweetness of ripe strawberries Emily still brought fresh from the farmer's market every June the way Dad once did. The simple soul-stirring harmonies of cherished old hymns she now hummed not always quite on key, or laughs shared over silly stories no one beyond their little circle would likely ever understand. All love that ever really mattered. So on Margaret's last morning as she lay propped in the raised hospital bed, warm spring sunlight spilling across faded quilts sent by long-mourned family friends, she focused on tessellating fragments of peace and contentment borrowed from 8 decades of momentary grace. Even shrunken and wizened as her body sank gradual into desired release, Margaret's spirit glowed yet with defiant sparks that death alone could never fully dampen. A soul spun of stardust borrowed fleetingly from time out of mind would not fade meekly into eternal silence. Not hers. As loved ones gathered round speaking words unheard now, but felt, Margaret let the rising tide pull her gently back home. Across the years she glimpsed George's crooked smile peering down from some bright doorway just ahead where beloved friends and family who left the sphere before her now waited joyous on some far shore she'd never stopped straining to glimpse all her days. With a quiet sigh, she closed her eyes as the last fetters fell away. Her essence shimmered iridescent, dissolving into refracted light, finally restored to the wholeness known before this brief precious incarnation span. Not ended, but expanded exponentially beyond confinement. And so she passed, blissful, back into the mystery from whence all life springs eternal. The monitor's flatline mute witness. Sobs and laughter fused harmonious filled a little room brimming with those left behind who loved Margaret most on this earthly plane. All part of the endless cycle that turns and returns, comforted by faith and boundless love that never dies. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.